You have been lied to your whole life. The history textbooks we studied from, the films we watched, and even the memorials where we lay flowers. All of this is part of a grand stage setting. Have you ever wondered why the official version of the 1812 war falls apart the moment you look closely at the details? We are told about a great confrontation, about a battle of two emperors, about patriotism and a burned Moscow. But what if I tell you that Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander I were not enemies? What if this war was not an invasion, but a joint, punitive operation? An operation to clear the territory of traces of a civilization that is today commonly called Great Tartary. Prepare yourselves, because today we will destroy the foundation of what you considered to be the truth. Let's start with a simple fact that historians diligently ignore or attribute to a strange fashion of that time. Look at the uniforms. If you take portraits of officers of the French and Russian armies of that period, remove the captions and mix them up, even a professional historian would struggle to tell who is who. The same epaulets, the same shirkos, the same cut, the same colors. We are told that this is simply a borrowing of fashion. Seriously, during a total war of annihilation, do armies dress practically identically? Imagine if during the Second World War, Soviet soldiers and Wehrmacht soldiers wore identical uniforms, differing only in minor details. That's absurd. But in 1812, this is somehow considered the norm. And what about the language? The Russian nobility spoke French better than their native Russian. They thought in French, wrote love letters in French, gave orders in French. They try to explain this to us as cultural influence. But think logically. You are fighting an enemy, but you speak his language, dress like him, and live by his cultural codes. Doesn't it seem to you that this is more like a civil war within one global system? Or even more frightening, the actions of a unified coalition army against someone else? Recall the Peace of Tilsit of 1807. Official history tells us about a forced alliance, but look at the medals issued in honor of this event. On them, the profiles of Napoleon and Alexander are placed side by side, like the profiles of two co-rulers, two brothers in arms. On some medallions, they are literally looking in the same direction. Symbolism at that time held colossal significance. No one would mint the profile of an enemy next to their own if there wasn't a real, deep alliance. There is a theory, and it is finding more and more confirmation, that by the beginning of the 19th century, Europe had already been seized by new elites, representatives of that very parasitic system that still rules the world. Alexander and Napoleon were the managers of this redistribution. Their task was not to destroy each other, but to pass with fire and sword through lands that still maintained loyalty to the old empire. That very empire, which on maps was designated as Grand Tartary or Great Tartary, and whose cities stood on the site of current ruins and wastelands. Let's turn to logistics. This is the area where official history suffers a complete collapse. We are told that Napoleon's Grand Army numbered around 600,000 men. 600,000! Can you imagine this figure in the realities of the early 19th century? Without railways, without motor transport, without canned goods and modern food preservation technologies. What did they eat? Historians tell us about foragers and supply trains. But let's calculate. A horse eats a certain amount of oats and hay per day. To feed an army of 600,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses, a continuous flow of goods is needed, which was physically impossible to provide along the dirt roads of that time, especially in the conditions of Russian mud season. Eyewitnesses of those events in their memoirs often get confused in their testimonies, describing sometimes ideal order, sometimes complete chaos, but never giving a clear answer to the question of supply. What if the army did not march on foot all the way from Paris? What if logistics were provided by technologies that were later seized and forgotten? Or more likely, the troops were already in the territory, quartered in captured cities, and the so-called invasion was simply a regrouping of forces for a final strike on Moscow. And here we come to the most interesting question. Against whom was this war actually waged? Look at Napoleon's route. It is a thin arrow aimed directly at the heart of the country, at Moscow. He did not try to occupy the south, did not go to Petersburg, where Alexander resided. Why Moscow for him? We are told, to impose peace. But Petersburg was the capital. The capture of the old capital did not have the strategic significance attributed to it, unless the goal was the destruction of something or someone who was located precisely there. In Moscow sat not just merchants and boyars. Moscow was the last stronghold of a power that obeyed neither Petersburg nor Paris. It was the center of the old world. And that is why two formerly warring armies actually herded the population and defenders of Tartary into this cauldron. Have you noticed how strangely Kutuzov behaved? He constantly retreated, surrendered positions, avoided pitched battles, as if letting Napoleon pass. The official version calls this a brilliant tactical maneuver. But an alternative view suggests something else. Kutuzov and his generals provided a corridor. They did not defend Moscow. They escorted the French army to its goal, so that by the hands of the French, or more precisely, by the hands of a united European coalition, they could accomplish what the Russian army could not do itself for ideological reasons: destroy the ancient capital along with its inhabitants and history. Look at the maps of that time. As late as the end of the 18th century, the Britannica Encyclopedia explicitly writes about Great Tartary as a gigantic state bordering Muscovy. And then, suddenly, at the beginning of the 19th century, this country disappears from political maps, remaining only as a geographical term. Where did millions of people go? Where did the cities marked on old globes go? They could not simply vanish. They had to be physically destroyed. The 1812 war fits perfectly into this puzzle as the final phase of the cleanup. This was genocide, disguised as an invasion. We were made to be proud of this war, called it the Patriotic War, so that we would never guess that our ancestors might have been not victors, but victims of this global conspiracy. And this is just the beginning. Next, we will talk about what actually happened in Moscow, and why the fire that is described to us looks more like the use of weapons of mass destruction than a simple burning of wooden houses. Technologies that, as we are assured, only appeared in the 20th century, left their radioactive traces on the stones of the 19th. Let's focus on an event that became the culmination of this strange war, the Fire of Moscow. Official history feeds us a primitive fable that the city was set on fire by its own inhabitants or saboteurs on the orders of Count Rostopchin. We are told that Moscow was wooden and therefore burned like a match. But this is a brazen lie, designed for those who have never been interested in the architecture of the early 19th century. By that time, Moscow was a city of stone palaces, brick manufactories, and magnificent cathedrals. Yes, there were wooden buildings, but they were located on the outskirts. The city center, the Kremlin, noble estates, these were stone. Brick does not burn. Stone does not burn. To make a stone city blaze so fiercely that bells in bell towers melted, a temperature unattainable with ordinary wood burning is needed. The melting point of bronze is about 1,000 degrees Celsius. To turn brick walls into dust and melt granite embankments, a thermal impact of colossal power is required. Read the memoirs of French officers, for example, Count de Ségur. He describes not just a fire, he describes an ocean of fire that behaved like a living creature. Eyewitnesses speak of flashes of light that illuminated the sky brighter than the sun in the middle of the night. What sun could be referred to when barns are burning? This description is characteristic of light radiation from a nuclear or other high-tech explosion. Moreover, the fire spread against the wind. This is a physical anomaly if we are talking about an ordinary fire, but a perfectly explainable phenomenon if it involves plasma weapons or aerial carpet bombing. Yes, you heard correctly. Who could have delivered such a strike? A third force. those who controlled both Napoleon and Alexander. The task was to erase the material culture of Tartary, to destroy archives, libraries, technologies stored in Moscow's underground. And now let's look at the consequences of this so-called fire. What happened to Napoleon's Grand Army? We are told, General Winter. Allegedly, the French, who had conquered all of Europe, forgot to bring warm clothes and froze. This is ridiculous. Climatic reports from those years show that the winter of 1812 arrived later than usual, and the frosts struck only after the army had turned into a crowd of fugitives. What then were they dying from? The symptoms described by regimental doctors are shocking: hair loss, skin ulcers, vomiting, diarrhea, disorientation. Soldiers went mad. Their teeth fell out. Historians call this typhus or an unknown fever. But any modern radiologist would tell you that this is a classic picture of acute radiation sickness. Napoleon's army entered the affected zone. They were in the radioactive ashes of Moscow for over a month. They drank contaminated water, breathed radioactive dust. That is why the Grand Army simply dissolved. They did not freeze. They disintegrated at a cellular level. Look at Russia's demographic data after the war. Official statistics record a strange dip. In some provinces, through which troops did not even pass, the population decreased by tens of %. Why? Because a radioactive cloud knows no boundaries. Fallout after the strike on Moscow covered vast territories. In villages and settlements, people died in entire families from plague ulcers, as it was then called. But it was not an infection, it was a radiation catastrophe. And the authorities knew this perfectly well. That is why a total reconstruction of Moscow began immediately after the war. The Commission for the Construction of Moscow, created in 1813, worked with suspicious speed. In a couple of years, the city literally rose from the ashes. Where did the resources come from? Where did millions of bricks come from if the factories were destroyed? Where did thousands of skilled masons come from if the male population had been decimated by war? The answer is simple. They were not building, they were excavating. They restored what survived and covered with soil what was too heavily damaged. Moscow's cultural layer is not the result of centuries of dust accumulation. These are meters of soil with which the first floors of buildings were intentionally covered to hide the traces of the catastrophe and the radiating ruins. We walk on the roofs and second floors of that antediluvian Moscow. The Polytechnic Museum, excavations on Lubyanka. Everywhere we see full-fledged floors extending deep underground with windows and doors. Who builds windows underground? No one. These are the first floors, which became basements after the Great Infill. Another fact that troubles researchers: the absence of mass horse burials. 600,000 people, hundreds of thousands of horses. Where are their bones? Archaeologists find isolated burials. If the army had perished from cold and hunger, the entire road from Moscow to Berezina should be paved with bones. But they are not there. Where did the bodies go? The cremation theory in those conditions does not withstand criticism. There wasn't enough firewood even for heating. What if the bodies simply evaporated at the epicenters of the explosions? Or were they disposed of by special cleanup teams using chemical reagents unknown to us? We are dealing with a crime of planetary scale, the traces of which have been covered up for 200 years. Pay attention to the medals for the capture of Paris and for the salvation of the fatherland. On them, a strange triangle with an eye is often depicted, the all-seeing eye, a Masonic symbol. It is everywhere, on the pediments of buildings restored after the fire, on award weapons, on state seals of that time. This is the signature of the client. Napoleon and Alexander were high-ranking Masons, executors of the will of a global lodge. Their correspondence, if read between the lines, is full of hints at the great work and the transformation of the world. The war was a ritual, a sacrifice. Millions of lives were laid on the altar of a new world order, in which there was no place for Tartary and a Vedic worldview. Ask yourselves, why did an era of reaction, the creation of the Holy Alliance, begin in Europe after 1815? It was the creation of a world government, a prototype of the European Union and an alliance. They united not to prevent new wars, but to control the captured territories and prevent the revival of the destroyed civilization. The entire history of the 19th century is a process of rewriting the past. Special commissions were sent to monasteries and archives, which confiscated chronicles, rewrote books, and destroyed maps. We were invented a history of the ancient world. Events were pushed back thousands of years to fill the void created after the cleansing of the real past. We live in a matrix created at the beginning of the 19th century, and the 1812 war is the starting point of this matrix. But the most terrifying evidence is hidden not in archives but in forests. Look at the age of forests in Russia and Europe. You will not find trees older than 200 years. Why? Go out into the forest. Look around. Do you see giant trees, 300, 400, 500 years old? No. Throughout central Russia, and indeed in Europe, the forest mass is strangely uniform. Pines and birches stand as if selected, all of the same diameter. If you cut down such a tree and count the rings, you will rarely count more than 150 or 200 rings. This is a biological fact that cannot be refuted. Official science tells us about industrial logging and local fires. But allow me, was absolutely everything cut down to the last sapling simultaneously over a gigantic territory from Paris to the Urals? This is technically impossible for that time. They did not have chainsaws and logging harvesters. The only logical explanation is the total destruction of the biosphere. A planetary fire or a shockwave that swept away ancient forests, leaving a scorched desert on which new growth began to sprout only in the mid-19th century. We live in a young forest, grown on the bones of a previous world. Old photographs from the late 19th century confirm this. In them, we see bare landscapes without a single tree, where today the taiga rustles. Now open satellite maps. Look at the strange circular lakes scattered across the Tver and Ryazan regions, across the territory of Belarus and Ukraine. There are thousands of them, perfectly symmetrical craters filled with water. Geologists babble something about karst sinkholes or meteor showers. But meteorites do not fall in clusters, creating tactical defense lines, and karst sinkholes do not form perfect circles with earthen embankments around the edges. These are craters from explosions. If you overlay a map of these lakes onto the route of Napoleon's army and the locations of Russian troops, you will see a frightening coincidence. Military operations were conducted with weapons of such destructive power that the earth was turned into a sieve. This was carpet bombing, the traces of which were hidden from us under the guise of natural landscapes. Who could have attacked from the air in 1812? The answer to this question will shatter your perception of reality. And what exactly were they bombing? Look at city plans from that time. Almost all major cities in Europe and Russia were surrounded by or built within so-called star fortresses, star bastions. Historians assure us that these were fortifications for defense against cannons and infantry. But this is a lie that crumbles with the first engineering analysis. The complex geometry of stars offers no advantages during shelling. On the contrary, it creates dead zones and complicates defense. However, this shape is ideal from the perspective of wave physics. These were gas distribution stations, power stations, space harmonizers of Great Tartary. Napoleon and Alexander were not going to capture cities. They were going to shut down the life support system. They were destroying the energy framework of the planet. That is why many star fortresses after the 1812 war were razed to the ground, and parks were laid out or prisons built in their place. The authorities were cleaning up free energy technologies to addict humanity to hydrocarbons and primitive manual labor. Now connect the facts. The destruction of forests, gigantic city fires, carpet bombing of the terrain. What happens when millions of tons of dust, ash, and soil are released into the atmosphere? Mud rains begin. And so we come to the unraveling of the so-called clay flood. This was not a worldwide flood in the biblical sense. It was a direct consequence of the war. Soil, lifted into the air by explosions, settled for years. It buried the first floors of surviving buildings, changed riverbeds, buried roads and bridges. The 3 or 4 meter layer of clay that we see in excavations around the world is sedimentary rock from that very catastrophe. People who survived the carnage were forced to dig out their homes, make doors from second-story windows, and start life anew in a world that had become grey, dirty, and cold. Official history calls this a cultural layer, but any builder will tell you a cultural layer does not grow at a rate of 1 meter per century uniformly across an entire city, covering windows and doors. And here the most tragic page of this cleanup opens. Where did the children go? In the mid-19th century, the world was engulfed by an unprecedented wave of orphanhood. Mysterious orphan trains appeared in the United States of America, and huge orphanages opened in Russia and Europe. Where did hundreds of thousands of homeless children come from simultaneously in all countries? Where were their parents? Why is the theme of orphanhood one of the most popular in the literature of that time, recall Dickens or Dostoevsky? The answer is terrifying. The adult population, the bearers of memory and skills, was annihilated during the war catastrophe. Children were taken away, their memories of the past erased, given new simple surnames, Ivanov, Petrov, Smith, Jones, and taught new primitive programs. They were prepared to be ideal slaves for the new industrial revolution. They were given a truncated history, an invented chronology, and led to believe that their ancestors were savages who lived in dugouts by the light of a splinter. We are the descendants of these orphans, who grew up on the ruins of a great civilization that we were forbidden to remember. Consider why there was a sharp technological decline at the beginning of the 19th century. Unique stone artifacts, the Hermitage vases, the Alexander Column, St. Isaac's Cathedral, all of this was supposedly created in the era of the chisel and hammer. But we cannot replicate this with modern CNC machines. The masters of the past possessed technologies for casting stone, processing granite like plasticine, creating geopolymer concrete. And suddenly, a sharp break. We move to crooked bricks and primitive steam engines, which are inferior in efficiency even to ancient mechanisms. This was technological degradation. We were thrown back hundreds of years in development. The 1812 war became the turning point after which humanity forgot how to fly on vimanas and how to get electricity from the atmosphere using temple domes. Napoleon did not take gold and furs from Moscow. He took away and destroyed blueprints, instruments, and manuscripts. Supply convoys with looted goods, which allegedly disappeared en route, actually reached their destination, but their contents settled in closed special storage facilities in the Vatican and London, far from the eyes of ordinary mortals. Look at the paintings of ruin artists of that time. Hubert Robert, Giovanni Piranesi, hundreds of lesser-known authors. Official science tells us that these were their fantasies, a strange, romantic fascination with ancient ruins, capriccio. But look closely. They painted from life. They were war correspondents and documentarians of that catastrophe. In their canvases, we see not invented worlds, but reality immediately after the war. We see Cyclopean ruined arches, mud-filled colonnades with trees growing directly on their roofs, and below, among these majestic ruins, tiny people scurry about. Ragged people cooking food over bonfires right in the middle of palace halls, grazing goats on fragments of ancient statues. These people did not build these structures. They technically could not have done so. They simply settled in them, like ants inhabiting an abandoned elephant's house. This is you and me. We are a civilization of squatters, occupiers, who took over someone else's palaces after the Great Cleanup. Walk through the historic center of St. Petersburg. Approach the doors of St. Isaac's Cathedral or the Winter Palace. Look at the doorknobs. They are at your head level, or even higher. Look at the steps of the stairs. They are too high and uncomfortable for a normal stride. The ceiling height in old buildings is 4-5 meters. Windows are so large that one person cannot open them. Why? We are told, for grandeur, for the pomp of the empire. This is nonsense. Architecture is always utilitarian and functional. These buildings were not built for us. They were designed for people 2.5 or 3 meters tall. These were the homes of Atlanteans, inhabitants of that very Tartary, whose physical parameters differed from ours. The 1812 war was not just a redrawing of borders. It was a war of biological species. A war of short but numerous invaders against a small but highly developed race of giants. And the giants lost not in fair combat, but as a result of a treacherous strike with weapons of mass destruction that wiped their cities off the face of the earth. Recall the Alexander Column. 600 tons of monolithic granite. A perfectly polished shaft. We are told a childish fairy tale about how simple Russian peasants in bast shoes, subsisting on bread and water, with the help of ropes and logs, hewed and raised this behemoth by hand. But any modern engineer working with heavy loads will confirm to you, this is technically impossible. Without powerful hydraulics, without cranes of appropriate lifting capacity, such a monolith cannot be installed vertically. And the processing? The column has perfect rotational geometry. To make such a thing from granite, a gigantic lathe and cutters stronger than diamond are needed. Where is this lathe? Where are the tools? They are gone, because they were confiscated. The technologies of that era surpassed our modern capabilities. We still cannot replicate the polygonal masonry of Kronstadt, where enormous granite blocks are fitted together without mortar, so precisely that a knife blade cannot pass through. These are traces of machine processing, traces of lasers, plasma cutting, and milling, not the chisel of a serf. We were given a primitive history so that we wouldn't ask questions. We live in stage decorations. The entire history of the 19th century is stitched together with white threads to hide the fact of monstrous degradation. We were given a smoking steam locomotive with an efficiency of 5%, and told that it was the pinnacle of progress, even though just yesterday our ancestors might have used atmospheric electricity and moved through portals. We walk on streets whose names have been changed, and live in cities whose foundations remember completely different masters.